and welcome to the CCDA podcast. My name is John Hull. I'm the CEO of the Everett Gospel Mission. I've been with EGM for about 20 years now and a part of the CCDA for about 8 years. I'm blessed to serve on the leadership team for both the CCDA Pacific Northwest Regional Network, as well as a network connector of the recently formed Snohomish County CCDA Local Network. And I'm your host for this episode. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Terence Lester, founder of Love Beyond Walls in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also the author of multiple books, including his recently released book, From Dropout to Doctorate. Dr. Lester, thanks for being here today.
John, I am really grateful to be here with you, but huge shout out to CCDA for creating this type of space where we could dialogue about these critical issues.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome to be joined together from across the country. I'm calling in from basically Seattle, Washington, and you're from Atlanta, Georgia. Have that correct?
Yeah, Atlanta, Georgia, all the way from Atlanta. And yeah, you know what? I've been thinking a lot about what's happening in society and culture, and I'm sure we have different experiences related to the work that we do, and I'm really grateful and excited to dialogue about it.
That sounds great. Well, hey, this is our first time meeting, so I'm curious to learn a little bit about you and the work you're called to there in Atlanta.
Yeah, as you stated, my name is Terence, and man, I was just talking to another colleague of mine about a very important question related to the work that we do. And there was this weird like moment of just like kind of like focusing on the work and like how we show up every day. And I just had this moment where I told him, man, I just want to be known as a servant. You know, that's what I want my life's legacy to be. Servant to my wife, servant to my children, servant to the community where we get a chance to walk with people. And that may show up in creating accessible public sanitation and hygiene for our members who don't have an address. That may look like retrofitting RV units to create space for people to have somewhere to rest, because research shows that 70% of people who are unhoused don't know where it is safe to sleep. That may look like starting a museum that represents the subject of homelessness, and according to companies, Fast Company, the first museum in the U.S. that does that, to humanize stories in a way that builds empathy towards this population. That may look like research. That may look like access to mental health support. That may look like access to healthy foods. That may look like retrofitting classrooms for unhoused students who show up every single day and may not connect with the lesson because they don't have on the proper size clothing, or they have stains in their clothes and their parents don't have washing machines. That may flesh out like a lot of different things, but I think to boil it all down is that we just are called to serve, man, and stand with people and be in solidarity with people, and not look at people as lesser than because they have less resources,
Mhm.
but have a shared humanity in what I would define as the beloved community.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love the title of or the label of your company, Love Beyond Walls, and the group that you're a part of is very different than my work as a CEO of a homeless shelter, where literally we're all about walls,
Yeah.
not putting them up to keep people out, but putting them up to keep people safe and drawing them in. Tell me, how did you get to this idea of Love Beyond Walls? And you've mentioned some of the work you're doing, but how did you land there?
Yeah. Yeah. I can share so many different stories. I would share this one story. I was 16 and a half years old, maybe 17 years old, and I'm about to drop out of high school, right? I was at an alternative school, and I was dealing with the trifecta of what I would call systemic injustice, personal trauma, right, and impoverishment. right? And all of those are intertwined and connected, and I can unpack all of those. But I got up from my desk, I walk out the front of the building because I was at an alternative school, and my friends joined me. We're less than 100 yards away from the school, and a man experiencing homelessness called over to our group. I was the only one to respond. And I walk up to him, trash hanging from his beard. He said he hadn't showered in over 2 weeks. And he's looking at me and he says, "Young man, is that your school back there?" And I go, "Yeah." And he says, "I don't want anything from you, but whatever you do, don't stop getting an education
Mm,
because one day you'll be a leader." I mean, you talk about disruption, right? He had no idea that I had experienced brief moments of homelessness as a child with my mom moving from place to place, or that, I had run away from home and experienced that as a teenager. He had none of that. And then in that brief moment, I felt seen, and not in the
mm,
ableistic sense, but in someone speaking to my very existence that cut through the noise of my social context. And years later, obviously, I went on to study the very thing that I was able to overcome. But it was instances like that where different people who became community, who were strangers, who saw me, who were proximate to me all throughout the years as I was navigating, overcoming a lot of these hardships. These people invested in me, and I would even go to the extreme of saying, like Miss West, when I was a fifth year senior, who allowed me to borrow courage and confidence that she had in me long before I had it in myself, and said, "Use my
mm,
classroom as a sanctuary." Mr. Moore, when I was living out of the trunk of my car as a teenager, when I had family conflict, said, "One day you're going to be a leader." The first man I could look into his eyes. Or Mr. Eason, when I was working in the back of a warehouse and I told him I had a dream of going to college, invested in my undergraduate degree and would champion me, the same guy that walked my wife down the aisle. Like, and, all of these different circumstances led me to become who I am. And I think it was God working in the proximity of people and helping me to see that I could continue to develop and lean into my natural skills and my God-given abilities, and all of that, right? When I got to the place where I felt like I was strong enough, I realized that I didn't have to use all of the education that I've amassed or like my experiences to just only serve me, to be self-serving. All of
mhm.
those things were to build capacity so I can contribute back to community. And I think all of those different circumstances led me to who I am, and the work that I do with Love Beyond Walls.
Wow. Wow. I am just so impressed by all the stories of all the different people that are part of your story. From it sounds like at 16, a gentleman living on the streets was a significant impact in speaking into your life, to many others along the way who invested and used their resources and their network to really help you be the man you are today. That is, I'm thinking so much about just CCD principles and just the idea of leadership development and a holistic approach and church based, and a beautiful picture of what community really is and what it can look like. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I love being able to share my story, one, because it reminds me that God is able to restore
Mm,
and to rescue and to show up in the community of people that surround you. But two, man, there are people who are working in the trenches.
mm,
We both know what that feels like. It can be full of isolation, funding shifts, funding
mhm,
cuts. It can be full of volunteer turnover, all of the things. I mean, you name it. And, the power of story, just not my own, but like to be able to be in community with people who are so beloved, but so overwhelmed
mm,
with a lack.
mm.
It's a great reminder that we are called to a beautiful work. It may be messy, it may be filled with struggle, but it's some of the greatest joys that I get a chance to experience.
Yeah, yeah. And we teach a poverty 101 class here, and it's all about doing relational poverty alleviation, helping without hurting. And so much of that is actually geared towards the attendees. Understanding and learning what their biases and prejudices are when they come to the table to walk with somebody experiencing material poverty. And one of the things I often love to tell them is you need that person experiencing material poverty more than they need you. You're going to learn, you're going to grow, and you're going to experience something beautiful with them in a way that you can't even imagine. And I just love listening to you because I'm just hearing so much of that. That that you created the space for that kind of relationship to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And, so I normally thank you for that work. I think education is one of the things that should build the empathy and compassion needed, and then mobilize the action.
Mm,
I was doing research. There is a researcher who is a clinician, Dr. Knowles. She argues that poverty itself should not even be separated from the word trauma, right? And sometimes
mm,
we put those two things in different buckets. Poverty itself is a form of trauma, so much so to the point that the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called poverty violence, right?
mm,
It is
mhm,
violence to see a child show up in school and they hadn't eaten until the day before, right? It is violence to see a person experiencing homelessness not have access to
mm,
sanitation. Joel Blue, in his book, The Visible Poor, even argues that we shouldn't even separate the term homelessness from the word poverty because it's at the root, right? But poverty
mhm.
is more than just economics. Poverty is social.
Yeah.
Poverty is spiritual.
Mm,
Poverty is occupational and environmental. Poverty is psychological. Poverty is physiological. Poverty is so much expansive and so much more than what we try to boil it down to. And most clinicians would argue that you have to have a well balanced, right, intersection of all of these things to be
mhm,
a stable person.
mm,
I was just talking to a guy earlier today, and we were even talking about the ACEs quiz that most people don't
mhm,
even know
mhm, mm,
anything about, adverse childhood experiences. I scored a 10 out of 10,
mm,
right? We
mm,
could talk about
mhm.
the history of that, but if you don't know, I would highly suggest really getting to understand some of the emotional struggles that or disadvantages that people have to overcome to even
Yeah.
get to a level playing field.
Yeah, yeah. I think what I'm hearing there is one of those things that we often miss in our communities is not recognizing the full story. In fact, I heard one
Yes.
person say, when he was meeting new people, he would always like to sit down with them and say, "Hey, I'm meeting you in chapter 6 of your life. Tell me about
Mm,
chapters 1 through 5." And
that's
I
right.
simply love that as a reality of how we connect with people. Just because you're experiencing homelessness today, there's a whole story before that, and a major part of overcoming um, that experience of material poverty is to enrich the relationships in what we do by knowing each other and hearing
That's
about
right.
your story.
That's
Yeah,
right. Relationships are key.
yeah,
Everyone has a story, right?
yeah,
And it's so important. Thank you so much for
yeah,
bringing that up, John.
yeah. There. Well, you know what? I'm loving the conversation. So you spent a little bit of time already talking about the breadth of what poverty really is. That it's more than just material poverty. That there's relationship and there's community, social, societal, systemic. I'm going to come up with some more S's in a minute, but I think what I really am excited to hear about is just a little more. Why is it important that we understand poverty as more than just material? What difference does that make, particularly as we're going to start talking about the president's executive order and its impact on what you and I are doing on a day to day basis.
Yeah, man. I mean that is a loaded question, and it's okay. So I'll start here. I was I talk about a story in my the book that's about to come out. I showed up in elementary school. I can remember the day vividly. I had experienced a form of violence the night before in my home context, right? I show up to school, right, traumatized. And if you do research, most clinicians would say that these signs can show up as PSTD, right, post traumatic stress disorder in children, and that can be in a number of ways. I'm sitting at my desk. My teacher, I remember her standing in front of the classroom and she was walking around. She had this thing in her hand and she's kind of tapping her hand and she's calling on students, right? Or my peers. And she gets me for whatever reason. She calls me out and she wants me to eh, eh, tell the answer. My voice is frozen. I experienced a very traumatic thing that had nothing to do with her, but I was carrying not only trauma from my social context, but I was in the classroom and I was overwhelmed, right? And you know what her response was? She told me to grab my desk, help me move the desk. She locked me in the closet,
Mm,
right? Uh, this closet with all of the resources, and I'll never forget all of the kids laughing, and I'm sitting in there doing my work or assignment by myself. She closed the door. Obviously, the light was on and everything, but I was isolated,
mm,
and that story still sticks with me
mm,
because that was a form of trauma and connected to not only the environment that I emerged from, but it was all intersectional. And now I have a social piece, right? Where
mhm,
when I go to school as a younger version of myself, I'm unable to connect with lessons because I'm
mm,
afraid that teachers, and now I have to carry this throughout my life, and now I've worked through that. But when you think of people who grow up in impoverished settings, like it's so much that impacts the every single second of life. The proper term could be urban hassles, right? You go outside. I can remember riding around in the car, looking out and seeing the dilapidated buildings, seeing
mhm,
potholes in the streets, seeing air pollution, which could be defined as environmental racism, seeing you know, food deserts or not having the best parts. These like just visual forms of impoverishment can impair you and impair your dreams or the ways in which you think about what you can become. You're not even talking about the occupational aspect. Like I grew up in the 1980s, 1990s. This is post civil rights, right out
mhm,
of Jim Crow. We see the height of social political rhetoric as a black man and young man matriculating through. We see the rise of Rodney King. We see the environment, the concentration of poverty from the residue of redlining. We see all of these things
mhm,
that contributes to not just a economic state of impoverishment, but a social state, an emotional state, a spiritual state, you know, and I navigated through all of those things. And
mhm,
so it is very important for people not just to think of poverty as economics, because what you see someone else may not have access to could have a laundry list of story or a set of circumstances behind it that you know nothing about.
wow, wow. As I'm listening to you, and wow, you have overcome a lot, and I can't even imagine what it took to overcome the trauma that you experienced in education to go on and get your PhD and become committed to really that academic pursuit. That's really impressive. I'm stricken by hearing all of that, and something I used to hear early on as a director at the men's mission was, which is one of the things that I did here at the mission. People would just ask, "Why can't those guys just go get a job?" And I'd often think about it, like there's there's no simple answer to that question because each person's story is different. But often I'd say, I want you to come hire them and talk to me in a couple weeks. Because what you
Yeah.
don't see on the outside is all the trauma on the inside, and there's
Oh
lots of
yeah.
work to be done. And I'm just hearing all of that as you're describing all the things you've had to overcome, and what it would have been like if somebody had just come up and said, "Well, the solution is you just need to go get a job, Terrence. What are you doing?"
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it takes a lot of work, and I've been
Yeah.
fortunate to find safe space. There are
Mm,
many, right,
mm, mhm.
of people. I would argue millions of people who haven't found safe spaces,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I was talking with a head of school here in the city of Atlanta. He leads the Ansley School. Shout out to Mr. James, Mr. Ray James. All of the students in that school are unhoused. It's over 100 students. The entire
Wow.
school. It's a private school, right? And
Wow.
we were having a dialogue in a conversation that I had on a podcast on my podcast, and he was talking about sometimes people don't understand that we are asking people to overcome 20, 30
Mm,
years of
mhm.
generational poverty and trauma with the questions that we pose.
Yeah.
Teresa Gowan, Dr. Gowan, in her book, Hobos, Hustlers, and Backsliders, she talks about the constructed idea of poverty, right? She says there are three narratives that normally we talk about when it comes to impoverishment. It's sin talk, sick talk, and system talk, right?
Mm,
In the sin
mhm.
talk category, we normally look at people who are matriculating through or navigating through poverty as being moral failures or being
Mhm.
lazy or having some type of character flaw or not working hard enough when in
Yeah.
reality, I know by fact, right, that people who are poor in this country work harder than anyone else than we can actually pay attention to, right? When they some people work
Yeah.
50, 60 hours a week and
3
still
jobs,
don't
4
make it.
jobs.
For a
Yeah.
job, I saw my mother doing
Yeah.
this,
Yep.
like literally, right?
Yeah.
Sick talk. We try to excuse away poverty by saying there's something clinically wrong, but
Mm,
we don't take into account that the system, mental health system, is overwhelmed. Right, there's no access supports for
mm.
people who are matriculating through, and it frankly it just costs a lot. Right,
Yep.
if
Yep.
you're listening to this and you go to therapy, whether you have a sliding scale or not, you have insurance, and just the absorbative amount of just constantly paying to have somewhere to sit down and talk to somebody about your traumas, it's just not present for many people. And then the system, like, we don't get a chance to really fully understand how, a politician can say we're going to evict the unhoused from being unhoused. Like, that doesn't make any type of sense. And we have to ask ourselves, what type of narratives are we believing about those that we've never met? But to reframe that and say, how do we actually get a chance to know people that we've been distanced from?
Yeah, absolutely. So all those things, interestingly, are things that without getting to know somebody, you can't know what's going on, right? So we talk about sin talk and we think it's a character issue, or we talk about sick talk and we think, okay, there's just something dysfunctional with the person or even systems. We don't know why that person's there. And the only way we can really get to it is by having a relationship, sitting down, having a conversation, listening to the community. If we're going to talk CCD principles, is
Yes,
we can't make
yes.
decisions from a distance, right? We got to be right there on the curb with them, having those conversations. Which, by the way, I did peek at a couple of your podcasts, and I love that work you do of just getting out there and sitting with somebody on the streets and interviewing them. I forgot the title of it, but I watched a
Oh
couple. What was that called
yeah,
again?
the Imagine Dignity podcast.
Yes, Imagine
Yeah,
Dignity. I love that
yeah.
approach, and really appreciate the way you do provide dignity in that conversation that way. I want to keep those three S's on the back burner. I'm going to ask a couple. Well, one question, and then we'll get into talking about the executive order. You mentioned narratives. I'd love to hear a little bit about in what ways have you seen or experienced a narrative shift around our unhoused neighbors over the last decade or so?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the narrative has become more punitive.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
actually did my entire dissertation on the state of Tennessee, which became the first state in the U.S. to make sleeping outside a Class E felony.
mm,
I
mhm,
was wrestling with one of my professors who was she's a political scientist, and you just don't mix documentary storytelling with public policy, right? And so
mhm,
I
mhm,
argued a methodology to use ethnography, but ethnocinema, to insert the unhoused communities' voices in the political discourse. Because when you look at rhetorical artifacts, or you go out there and you look of what people are saying in regards to the unhoused community from people who are in power, most times it's in with a criminal lens. It's with
mhm,
this
mhm,
idea of public sanitation, and it's talking about the humanity of people that, in many instances, they haven't ever met. And so I lived on the streets in the state of Tennessee, 4 cities. I interviewed. I got a chance to understand how public policy and political speech is actually causing a sense of self harm, right, in
mhm,
real time to the unhoused community. I asked questions. How do you feel? How does this make you feel?
mhm,
And in my data, got a chance to transcribe people saying, I don't feel like I belong here. I don't feel like I
mm,
have any community.
mhm,
Churches are working with law enforcement to make sure I can't stand on even church grounds, right?
mhm,
Less than a mile away from the very motel, the Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, right? When he was taking a stance against poverty in our country. Like, I
mhm,
got a chance to hear firsthand how the social rhetoric around this population of people causes real harm. And I think that's where we are. We've seen the evolution of that, the Supreme Court ruling that happened last year, right? We've
mhm,
seen, more dialogue about homelessness, but it's
mhm,
almost in a punitive way.
mhm,
What can we
mhm,
do to get rid of? And in most cases, if you look at data, most cases, there aren't enough shelter beds. Thank you for the work that you do to actually provide support for this population. And we
mhm,
see
mhm,
more ordinances and laws popping up everywhere. And it's like my friend Matt said in Chattanooga when I was interviewing him in the woods, he hadn't even heard about the passing of this bill that became state law. He says, "How do you, if I'm outside and I'm outside, how do you tell me to leave outside?" Right? And it's like one of those things. So
wow.
I'll pass it back to you. What have you been hearing?
Oh, I think that I love your word punitive. Definitely hearing the nature of seeing poverty, seeing homelessness as a character flaw is a big part of it. And a lot of the narrative is so conflated, which I mean, even as we get into the executive order, they're conflating homelessness and crime in a way that is, I think, damaging. And because of that, it's creating a lot of fear. And so, from not folks on the streets, but folks in our neighborhoods and in our communities, there's a lot of fear. I hear a lot of frustration. For me as a CEO, I get people calling all the time who are frustrated with what's happening in their neighborhoods,
Mm,
and learning to balance that has been really challenging.
yeah.
For our shelter, we had an interstate not far from our shelter, in fact, right outside the door, that created a large 100-foot stretch of a covering that turned into a massive encampment. And what was difficult for us about that is we had individuals that wanted to come in and benefit from our services and even join our recovery programs.
Mm,
And they would say to themselves, I can't recover there when that's right outside. And so we had to really navigate this different kinds of people experiencing homelessness and at different states in their homelessness,
yeah.
and how do we serve those populations well. And I live in the community where I serve, and I want my kids, I've got a lot of kids, and I want my kids to be able to walk around the neighborhood and feel safe, because a lot of times what seems unsafe isn't actually unsafe, it just feels that way. And so learning to separate those things, that just because I feel unsafe doesn't mean I am unsafe, is really important. So for us over the last 10 years, it's been figuring out how to navigate different populations, you might say, and different individuals experiencing homelessness that are in different states of their homelessness and looking for different ways to either get out of it or find help.
Yeah.
And that's been a challenge. And for us up in the Northwest, the fentanyl crisis has been devastating and really
Yeah.
changed a lot of our approaches in trying to even pursue relational methodologies when that crisis leads to individualization and those partaking in that substance use disorder wanting to isolate so much. And then
Yeah.
add on top of that methamphetamine changing and creating a lot more psychosis in the people experiencing homelessness who are using that. And now you get what looks like a really scary person isn't, but looks like it because they're acting so different than what we're used to. And part of our big work here is to say we've got to overcome that bias that just because you're not comfortable doesn't mean that person's dangerous and doesn't mean we need to take legal action to solve the problem. There's got to be compassionate ways we can approach this as communities. And those are big conversations we have at churches who want to help but are also nervous about somebody coming in and sitting in the pew next to them. Like, how do
Mm,
they learn to do that well without creating a sense of not belonging for the individual experiencing homelessness?
yeah.
Challenging things to do.
Yeah. It breaks my heart that we're talking about physical space
Mm,
that dictates the way that we talk about human beings,
mm,
right? When people come to the museum and they
mm,
bring up like drug addiction, I'm like, well, there are people with houses that have the same type of addictions or mental. There are people who right now who have housing that have, challenges
mhm,
mentally, right?
mhm,
And I normally think about homelessness in this way, that homelessness is one of the only justice issues where you can be labeled for what you don't have, right? And then
mm,
punished for trying to survive it. If you
mm,
didn't have a truck, I
mhm,
wouldn't call you truckless. If you didn't have on shoes, I wouldn't call you shoeless, right? And so, like,
mhm,
the very, this whole notion around using housing or not having access to housing to dictate how we talk about people who should, as you said, experience compassion and love. These are still our neighbors, right? Just
yeah,
because a
yeah.
person doesn't have an address does not mean that they are not our neighbor. And for
Mhm, mhm,
Christians in
mhm,
particular, it really breaks my heart when I am talking to or even around people who, will quote Jesus, right? But still have vitriol or
yeah.
some type of, towards our neighbors who don't have an address. When Jesus himself
Mhm,
says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, right?
yeah,
And I
yeah.
just think we have got to reframe how we
Mm,
talk about people who don't have an address. I like to not use something as basic as an address to dictate how I show up and love my neighbor.
mm, mhm, mhm,
And I think that's important. And as you stated, like, people are from different places. Everybody's experience is not the same, and the way that public policy and the way that people talk about it from positions of power can create the type of generalization that places all people experiencing homelessness in one singular bucket, right?
mhm,
That
mhm,
maybe because they are without housing, they're criminal, or maybe they are to
mhm,
be feared, or maybe they need to be arrested,
yeah,
or maybe they
mhm,
need to be publicly sanitized. And the thing that I always push back against, too, for people trying to understand this is one of the largest groups of people who are experiencing homelessness are not adults. They're
Mm,
actually
mhm.
youth and children,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Just take, for instance, the number of students in APS school system, which is Atlanta public school system where I am, is
Mhm.
higher. The number of unhoused students is higher than a point in time count of adults in the city, right?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And that's
Yeah.
according to McKinney-Vento, right,
Mhm.
Act
Mhm.
that defines homelessness based on dwelling and all of that stuff. So
Mhm.
we, I'm always asking, when you think about homelessness itself, what comes to your mind? It's just not a few brothers or sisters on the street corner, right? It's
Mhm.
much more vast, it's much more
Yeah.
complex, and homelessness itself is a global issue. It's not just something that's happening in a few cities. Like, there are over 150 million people in the entire globe, right, that does not have adequate access to
Mm.
housing. And that's why I love ML King's, framing of, we live in a world house. And if the world is our address, anybody that we come in contact with is our neighbor.
Mm. Yeah, I think Jesus said something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, he
Who is
did.
my neighbor? All my
Who
fellow
is
men.
my neighbor?
Who is my neighbor? And it is a fascinating thing that we've really separated that because somebody looks different, experiences life differently, and just is plain different. And the danger of using differences to separate ourselves
Mm,
is not healthy for us as a community. I mean, you guys, we all know that in CCD work. So hey, I think let's jump into the executive order because we've talked about grouping all homelessness into one category, and this is something where intentionally or not, it comes off that way. You know that we recently, I think it was end of July, President came out with a new executive order that he called "Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets,"
yeah. On the
and so
24th, actually. On the
okay,
24th.
okay,
Yeah.
there it was, and you and I both know this is not about crime and disorder necessarily, but about homelessness and people living on the streets in our communities, because that's what really comes through in the order. So tell me a little bit about what is in the order and what does it mean for your community.
Yeah. I remember where I was when I first saw the pings and stuff popping
Mm-hmm,
up on my phone.
hmm
And I was like, what is happening, right? And started seeing the news headlines about, you know uh, public statements that are being made by the current administration about evicting the unhoused community from DC.
hmm
And man, I started to have this, like, almost anxious moment, right? Because many of us who do this work know that we love our community, that the stories are much more broad and complex than, sweeping statements can define or really understand the different stories that we encounter. But also, like, there is this sense that is almost indirect about this order that also places a target on people who are doing this work, right? It's not just the the people who are unhoused, but it's also indirect a target for people who are doing this type of work. For instance, like, you know these types of statements that are made in the order, and then ordinance pops up and say you can't do food sharing, right? And so, like,
hmm hmm
there's, if we're friends and we're standing on the corner, like, I can share my meal with you. But if you're visibly unhoused, right,
hmm
or appearing to be unhoused, then that's a ticket. And now I become, so it was that sort of thing. And then I started the reading of it,
hmm
right,
hmm
which uses the social framing language that is very dangerous because it started out with this criminal language, right?
hmm
And using terms like dangerous and all of these things, which this kind of framing itself shapes public perception
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
associates homelessness itself with fear, with crime, disorder. When you think of these terms,
Mm-hmm.
like you almost
Mm-hmm.
like are on guard, right? And then it starts to go into more like punitive measures, which is why I used that term earlier. And punitive responses is like arrest,
Yeah.
government sanctioned encampments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Mm-hmm.
fines or public sweeps or, involuntary commitment, like placing people who are unhoused in jail, right? And so there's this public perception from the order when you read it, like if you really read it slowly, that that the reason why we see so much crime, the reason why we see so much chaos is because of the unhoused community. And when you read it, if you don't know a lot about homelessness work, you're like, oh yeah, like
Yeah.
what do
Yeah.
we need to do? We need to send the troops, literally, or send
Yeah.
law enforcement,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever it may be, to like let's make sure everybody's safe. But
Mhm.
what isn't spoken is that when you are unhoused, you're already vulnerable. You're
Mhm.
already susceptible to violence, exploitation, longstanding neglect, and framing this community as being a danger not only upholds this social stigma about it, but it erases a person's humanity. It doesn't consider that this may be somebody's grandma, somebody's sister, somebody's child, somebody's brother, somebody's uncle, somebody's cousin, somebody's nephew. The humanity part is kind of taken away. And
Mm.
so, I like to say that, you know, if you read section one, you'll talk about it talks about disorderly behavior, sudden
Mhm.
confrontations, all of this stuff,
Mhm. Mhm.
unsafe. But I want to be clear in why I'm framing it all this way is because homelessness is an experience. It's not a person.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
Absolutely.
no one actually, is born into the world and say, "Hey, sign me up." Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
nobody says sign me up, and no one heals from being punished
Mhm.
by being attacked. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
towards the end, and I'll pass it back to you. It talks about removing funding from housing first initiatives.
Yeah. Yeah.
To deprioritize them. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Mhm.
When research, verifiable empirical data
Yeah.
states that when you house a person, you get somebody stable, you wrap them with community support or wraparound services, that there is a higher probability of that person becoming stable
Mhm.
and finding a pathway towards overcoming the plight of homelessness, right? That, I mean, there's data for that, and eliminating support for things like that. It's like saying, heal before you get a place to rest.
Mhm.
you know
Mhm.
try to
Mhm.
figure it out before we we actually support you and
Yeah.
give you the type of uh, supports that you need. And so for me, when I read this, not only do I see the targeting that kind of erases the humanity of this
Mm.
beloved community, but it indirectly shifts funding from people showing up in this work. And it doesn't necessarily talk about solutions, which I there's
Yeah.
no solutions in the order. So like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Did you read it, and
Oh
what do
yeah,
you think?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I've been inundated with thinking a lot about it. I have to just take a minute to reflect on something as you were talking, and I just was realizing I don't know that there's ever been a time in human history, and I'm not a researcher, but I just can't imagine that there's ever been a time in human history where we have collectively come up with good solutions by dehumanizing those that we don't like. I just cannot imagine. And you're right. There's a lot of dehumanization happening here, intentionally or not. The impact is still the reality that we're collectivizing individuals experiencing something in our society as all criminal or as all disorderly, and
Mm,
creating chaos on our streets, and then creating solutions that may or well, they're not likely to work because they're just based on improper assumptions about the individuals we're serving, because we're not treating them
mm,
like human beings. We're
mm,
approaching them like problems. And so when we approach human
mm,
beings like problems, we create failed solutions. Right? That's a
mm.
broken person problem, creating broken systems, and it's just not good for us. So I thank you for your phrase "erasing humanity" is such a beautifully aggressive and real term that I will use. I'm going to steal from you, and I'll try to make sure I recognize you in it. But I appreciate you bringing that. Yeah, I definitely. So in my work, in rescue mission work, I'm associated with a lot of gospel rescue missions around the country. In fact, I just spent last week with the CEO at the Atlanta Rescue Mission and many others at a summit in Chicago where we gathered together and talked a little bit about the executive order. And one of the authors of the executive order, who wasn't present at that particular meeting but is highly involved with rescue missions, has shared a lot about how he drafted this. So, personally, I find myself in a really interesting space of knowing the people that are supporting this executive order and being somebody who is really concerned about conflating people experiencing homelessness with crime and disorder.
Yeah.
I'm not, just to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the term criminalizing homelessness, because I think it gets to a polarization that doesn't help us have conversation. It's just one side says you're criminalizing it, the other side says you don't, and now we're polarized again. And a lot of my work and efforts is to try to move to the middle and move away from those polarizing elements so we can have real conversations of knowing and understanding each other. And so I don't like the executive order from that standpoint, that I think it is actually creating and conflating crime and homelessness. And we just shouldn't do that for the sake of those experiencing homelessness and for the sake of those who want to help. I think it harms us both. And so when I'm living in my home and I'm not in this work, let's say, or I'm just a neighbor, my neighbor out there thinking that every homeless person is a criminal, that's not good for them, right? And if there's someone who claims Christ as their Lord, it's really not good for them, because that's just not the way we ought to be approaching things. Certainly not relational. So grave concerns in our area. That first, I think, is what section 2, talking about civil commitments.
Hmm.
Lots of conversations with the local PD and the chief of our local police departments and our fire department, and the impact, again, of methamphetamine and fentanyl on their work. And they're saying we don't have the resources and the tools we need to help these individuals. Now, I know I'm talking to individuals that sincerely care, and I know that doesn't necessarily represent all the force. And so I always want to keep that in mind, that something like a civil commitment, power, and authority is a very dangerous weapon for us as a community. And so that, I just want to advocate for all churches out there. If your community is going to embrace this concept of civil commitment, you better make sure that where people are being committed and those mental health facilities are taking care of people the way that Jesus would want them taken care of. So if somebody's deemed unable to really make a decision to be able to stop the use of that drug, and that use of those drugs or their mental health is a danger to themselves and others, it's our obligation to make sure that we're providing dignified care and dignified solutions for them that Jesus would approve of. That hasn't always been the case. And it really is hard to do when we give the power with things like associating with ending crime and disorder on America's streets. I keep coming back to that title because I don't want us to forget that this was a violent act of trying to address what was understood as violence. But it's a title that kind of empowers anger and frustration. And as human beings, when we operate out of that, we don't make good decisions. And so I hope we'll all take a step back and recognize we are working with individual humans made in the image of God, and that it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we're providing dignified and humane solutions. That if our mom or our dad or one of our kids had to be treated, it's a way that we would be okay with, and not just, well, at least they're not on the streets and they're not bugging me anymore. That's the easy out and then the unhealthy out. So that civil commitment up here in Washington, I'm a little less concerned because there's a whole lot of really, really strong civil rights advocacy from privacy and information and mental health work. I don't see it working out well. I'm curious from your perspective in Atlanta how you could see that being either worked out or even weaponized in your communities.
Yeah. Before I answer that, so where are the spaces, right, that
Hmm.
people will be committed to?
Yeah, that's a great
You
question.
know,
And how are they going
this
to
is
fund
a
it?
question
How are they
because,
going to
like,
support it?
during deinstitutionalization period,
Yeah, yeah.
lots of
Hmm.
support centers and things like
Hmm.
that were actually closed down.
Yeah.
My
Hmm.
argument with that whole section is that the system, the mental health space, healthcare system
Yeah.
right now cannot even handle all of the growing needs in
Hmm.
communities. And so,
Hmm. Hmm.
my concern is that, like yours, a place of care, but my concern is where are the places?
Yeah. Yeah.
Have
Yeah.
we ever seen any of those places on the news? Have we ever heard them named out loud? Can you point to one
Yeah.
in your actual community? Because I
Hmm.
can ride the streets in the communities where I am. I don't see them. I don't know where
Hmm.
they are.
Hmm.
And so we have to be sure that when we're actually reading documents like this and
Hmm.
hearing from people who maybe authored or like whatever, we have to ask those questions because
Yeah.
sometimes that information is left out and we are not clear as to
Hmm.
where people are going. That could be
Yeah.
similar to the 1996 Olympics that happened in Atlanta or any, major events in other parts of the city where the city gave a bunch of bus tickets to the unhoused community and bust them out.
Hmm.
Nobody ever saw people ever again. And so, like, where are people going, right? And as a policy scholar, I have to ask the question, not just who holds the power, but who has the power to determine where people go, who has the power to say where people are going to end up, who has the power to dictate the the experiences that people's lives may encounter and have. And
Hmm.
as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we got to ask, like you're saying, like, you know, not only where are those places, but um, where who is communicating or who
Hmm.
who can we hold accountable
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
giving us the information, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm often reminded of the ways in which Jesus saw people, but he was also proximate to people.
Hmm.
He was so
Hmm.
deeply moved with the concerns and the overwhelm of people that it says in Matthew 9, when he saw people weary and helpless, he was
Hmm.
moved with
Yeah.
compassion, right? And I
Hmm.
think a part of
Hmm.
that compassion is also asking critical questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
I need to be able to see and know and
Mm.
have the vital information so I can give a critique. I know what has been an impact in my community historically, right? I know what has been an impact where, in certain neighborhoods that were redlined historically 50 and 60 years ago, the residue of that is still showing up generationally in those communities. I visibly see that. And so you add an additional layer of like executive orders that can also be used to further stigmatize, say, like Black and Brown or BIPOC people that are
Mhm,
in communities that are concentrated with poverty. That concerns me. And so
mhm, mhm,
when I hear rhetoric when I read documents. I'm always asking where show me,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
we got to be
Mhm.
clear. That's all I'm
Yeah.
saying. Yeah.
Yeah. It's easy to identify problems.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean you've accurately identified it, but it's easy to call out a problem and make a lot of noise around it. But actually starting to talk about how we implement these things when, we're talking about, okay, let's help individuals experiencing mental health. Great.
Yeah.
Where's the funding to support, and
Yes.
not just at a taxing or at a government level, but as a community level? Like, am I willing, are our neighbors willing to invest the dollars necessary, and frankly the time in relationship? Because
Yeah.
part of our mental health crisis is not simply just that we don't have enough systems, we don't have enough relationships in general, and we're experiencing a massive amount of brokenness due to our isolation as individuals that don't live in community and don't experience these differences together. And so we go through this
Yeah.
grief, we go through this brokenness, we keep asking ourselves, is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with me?
Yeah.
And that's causing an even deeper level of trauma at a
Yeah.
societal level, I think.
Yeah. And
And
clinicians too,
yeah.
right? Because I
Yeah.
mean, like my sister is a clinician, uh, Dr. Lester up in DC area, and she'll tell you like she's a social worker and she has, you know, 5, 6 schools, right? As a
Mm-hmm.
social worker, as a clinician, how do you provide care, right? This is what I mean by the system is overwhelmed. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you have a counselor or a social worker responsible for multiple schools. You have hundreds and hundreds of students, and you don't
Mm-hmm.
even have the bandwidth within yourself to provide those types of supports. You think about larger
Mm-hmm.
society,
Yeah.
clinical shortages, and all of those things. And so
Yeah.
that's what I mean
Yeah.
by the system is overwhelming. That's why I agree with you when we say we not only need to invest, but we need to invest in, you know, students who want to go to school, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Access higher education to become the helping professionals that's actually needed to stand in full support in communities that need this types of support. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Well, I'm looking at a question here of advice to stand in solidarity with unhoused individuals, and I think, I mean, you just spoke about a number of things. One is I heard the importance of proximate and being proximate to individuals. That if you don't start there, which just obviously reminds me of the first principle in CCD actions of just relocation. Sometimes that doesn't mean you have to move into the neighborhood. Sometimes it means you got to move your feet next to somebody experiencing it, and be proximate, because I can make up all kinds of ideas of what I think the solution is. But if I'm not talking to the people experiencing it, I'm not going to be providing healthy solutions. So
That's
that
right.
that I like to I like to say shut up and get next to somebody, right? So just stop talking,
That's
thinking
right.
you got the solutions. Get next to somebody is a good way to begin standing in solidarity. What are some other things that you'd like to share of how individuals, as well as how collectively churches? Because I'm thinking about, as you were mentioning clinicians, it strikes me the church doesn't talk about mental health in our area very well, and it
Yeah.
certainly doesn't support families going through it very well.
Yeah.
Personally, I had a mental health crisis with one of my kids, and frankly, the local public school was more helpful and more supportive than my church was. And I don't think it's because my church didn't want to be; it just didn't know how to be. And
Yeah.
so the local public
Yeah.
school was practicing and intentional and ready and supportive and
Trauma informed.
trauma informed, and they cared for us. I mean, I to get a call from the local school principal and go, "How are you?" It actually it still gets me emotional to think that, like, who, you don't even know me and you called me, and I just didn't get that same kind of support from the local church necessarily. And so I, I'm going off here, but I think, as we think about that standing in solidarity, I'd love to hear, individual recommendations as well as to the church. How does the church, because CCD work is about being church based, how does the church step into some of this, particularly as we're talking about the executive order and maybe negative outcomes that are going to come from it, perceptions, like what do we need to do?
Man, I have so much to say. I'm deeply heartbroken at your experience. I had a similar experience in 2022. I was in a near fatal car accident. Was almost paralyzed, severe nerve damage, and after surgery said that it would take a year to a year and a half to walk again, I had to learn how to walk again. Like
Oh my
my
goodness.
wife became my primary caregiver. If it wasn't for insurance, I don't know where I would be. But the the church, speaking of specifically, a community of faith, but this is can be similar ways of showing up. But no phone calls, no trauma informed care, no space to grieve, no lament.
Mm-hmm.
And what ended up happening in turn is the religious trauma or
Mm-hmm.
theological trauma that happens, right? Because, uh, you know, people started to try to explain away what happened, right? Or try to rush you past your pain, or not even have the empathetic knowledge or trauma informed care, or even learning about that in ways to show up with people. I think we need a theology of suffering. Like, how do we actually
Mm-hmm.
approximate ourselves to people in a healthy way without feeling like we have to fix it or
Mm-hmm.
explain
Mm-hmm.
why it happened in your life? Because every explanation could come off different, right? I had people tell me that God wanted to do this because of this, or you needed to, and try to be a spokesperson, when in actuality, you have to just have practice a ministry of presence. And that's what I'm getting at.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do
Yeah.
churches
Mm-hmm.
think of even turning a space that may only be used twice a week into a multi-purpose facilities, encouraging therapists in the local community that if they want to give pro bono, support services to the community, that to use their space to actually creating ways for the congregation and the ministerial team to be trauma informed. I've done all types of
Mm-hmm.
trauma informed pedagogical trainings and care, trainings to, higher learning educational professionals. But what about churches, right? Lament is all throughout the scripture, and we
Mm-hmm.
have to have the type of faith that has the capacity to
Mm-hmm.
allow suffering to be in, because it's not our job to fix things as much as it our job to say that we serve a God that can comfort those in the
Mm-hmm.
midst of their struggle. And that's through the body of Christ, right? By
Amen.
us showing up. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? And so
Mm-hmm.
I wish we had more churches that were trauma informed, that utilize their sanctuary and their spaces to invite in the type of supports that is needed by the community. But also on the individual level, I always go back to proximity, because proximity is what informs everything.
Mm-hmm.
You can never meet the needs of people that you've never met. But if you've never met people, then how can you stand aside and create all sorts of stories and judgments about them? Go meet people, but
Yeah.
you have to also create the type of margin in your life that
Mm-hmm.
affords you the opportunity to be in relationship with people, because there are a lot of willing people. It's just not a lot of available people, right?
Mm-hmm.
If your schedule is busy, you're going to treat service or proximity to people like an event, not a lifestyle. That's
Mm-hmm.
what Jesus pushes us to do. He had this type of proximate nature about himself that was a part of who he was. He was a life. I don't know. He practiced proximity in a way. It was just like, man, I want to be that, right? And it also will inform you
Yeah.
how to show up in other ways, because every person is different, every community is different, and we
Mm-hmm.
need to approximate ourselves so we can understand how we are
Yeah.
best able to serve them.
Man. I Margin for relationship, another great phrase. I just got all these little things here from this conversation that are just fantastic, and I just reflect on just the incarnation is our guide in this issue.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
Jesus is rich and leaves it behind to come into the poverty of this world and the poverty of humanity and experience that
Mm,
with us. He
mm,
could have fixed it,
mm,
and he didn't. He experienced it with
mm,
us. I'm not saying I understand that mystery. I don't, but I love that his passion was to dwell with us. And so figuring out ways to dwell with the other, to dwell with those on the margins, and to create space for relationship to happen there. The truth is, if we just do that, we're going to figure out answers. And sometimes that's
Mm.
just going to be walking together in pain. And sometimes that's going to be real work that we're going to do in our communities of feeding and building places without walls and addressing cleanliness, addressing mental health through relationship, and maybe not through medications. And I'm not saying I'm opposed to medications, just think it's a holistic solution that we need to be talking about. And I'm just hearing so much that passion and that desire for incarnating ourselves with others. And
Yes.
yeah, that's going to be challenging. But I do know this, and you and I both know this. If we step into that space, we're going to be more blessed than we're able to provide blessings to others. I know that's the truth for me. In walking with people experiencing poverty and people experiencing homelessness, I have been more changed and more blessed than I will ever be able to offer to them.
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah. I
Well,
mean,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Thank you.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Some of my greatest stories of friendship have come out of the work that I get a chance to do. And
Mm-hmm.
wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Terence. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation for me, and I can't wait for a time I'm going to be in Atlanta, and I'm definitely going to look you up and buy you lunch, and we're going to have some time together. And just I'm going to finish us off here with a thank you all for everybody out there listening to this CCDA podcast. And again, thank you, Terence, for joining us today. If you want to learn more about Terence's book, which I know I've got it up on my browser, and I'm going to be hitting purchase or pre-purchase here in just a second. It's called From Dropout to Doctorate. And if you want to learn more about CCDA, check out the show notes of this episode. So don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. This episode is produced by Sarah Callan in association with Christina Four. And we'll be back soon with another episode featuring CCDA practitioners who are committed to seeing people and communities experience God's shalom. We'll see you then.